this will be officially their last season in the Big 12. Carl, I ask you this. What do they need to accomplish this year to make you feel good about these teams moving to the SEC?
They need to finish at the top of the Big 12, and they need to show that they can play and dominate at that level, because if you can't win the Big 12, you're going to have your hands awfully full in the SEC, and you're going to be full in the SEC anyway. Former Oklahoma great legendary coach Barry Switzer said to the Tulsa World that he wants to know who at Oklahoma made the decision for Oklahoma to go in the SEC, and he was nervous about such a move. We know how competitive the SEC is. We know how tough of a league that is, and you have to show progress in terms of that you can compete at the top of the Big 12 for people to even feel like you have a shot in the SEC.
Yeah, you know what, Carl? I totally agree. And the part that really blew my mind was, as much as it was about Barry Switzer and obviously his legacy at Oklahoma and why they made the move, I was absolutely baffled by Texas. Texas has their own network. They had a pipeline. Money was not an issue for them. And so now they step into a league where, instead of being obviously the cream of the crop and things, now they're going to have an uphill battle. I mean, 8-5 under Steve Sarkisian after losing to Washington in the Alamo Bowl. You got an Oklahoma program that had their first losing season since, I believe, 1998, stepping into the SEC after just one more year in the Big 12. Not only do they have to, I think, be number 1 and number 2 in the Big 12, which I don't think they're going to do. The biggest issue for both those programs, neither one of them plays a lick of defense anymore. And if you don't play defense in the SEC, you don't have a prayer of competing in that conference with those teams. And so I think they have a lot to prove, not just from a wins-loss perspective, but a style of play perspective.
Carl, Nigel, I agree with what you said from a defense perspective, especially Oklahoma with the problems they had on that side of the ball this year. But I have to pivot back to Carl, because Carl, I just need to ask, did I convince you last week with the Texas OU discussion? Because you said they need to win the Big 12 this year and prove they can perform in that league before moving on. And I believe we had a different conversation last week. But I do totally agree with what Carl said on that point. For Texas especially, the expectation is winning the Big 12 this year. They have every advantage compared to the rest of the league from a roster perspective. The rest of the league, except for maybe Kansas State, at least at the top, got worse with the losses they had. Texas needs to win. Oklahoma, for its part, needs to build on the top 5 recruiting class it had. It needs to prove it can hold up along the lines of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. And Oklahoma needs to bounce back from its first losing season since the 90s. Both teams need to make significant strides to take advantage of their last year in the league.
Now, hold on a second, Chris. I didn't say Texas was going to win the Big 12, so don't say. I said they have to show that they can win the Big 12.
And I believe we had the same discussion last week, and you said Texas shouldn't feel like it could win the Big 12 because it hasn't won the Big 12 recently.
Okay, well, in all fairness, at the time you guys had that discussion, we didn't know that they were leaving early, so maybe Carl's opinion changed. He said, they have 2 years before they have to go to the SEC. Now we know that they only have 1 year until they have to go to the SEC. But, Carl, I'll ask you this. I mean, I heard Nigel kind of mentioned Texas has a lot of money, right? They have their own network. They have so much going for them, not just in football, but a lot of other sports as well. So why do they need to leave early?
I didn't understand why they needed to leave at all. I didn't know that. I didn't understand that move. Own network, tons of money. You haven't dominated the Big 12, which is a conference that's nowhere near on the level of the SEC. Texas has been in the football wilderness for over a decade. I mean, it's just been really tough. And I don't know how you go into the SEC and compete at the highest level with the teams you have to play. And I'm going to tell you this. I don't think that you can compete in the SEC with only kids from the state of Texas. You have to also show that you can recruit nationally. We have been proven that hasn't been the case. Texas and Texas A&M are in what is supposed to be the premier state in the country for high school prospects, and man, they have struggled mightily to get over the hump. And I just don't see how that's going to change for going to the SEC.
Hey, Carl, I got the answer. I figured it out. It's one word, and it's 3 letters. Ego. Ego made Texas make that move from the Big 12 to the SEC. Because going back to our days of watching R.C. Slocum and go back to all those days of watching those great Texas and Texas A&M battles on Thanksgiving weekend, and then they saw their partner bail on them and go to the SEC, and have a little bit of success, have a Heisman Trophy winner. And they were sitting back there going like, well, how come we can't have this? We used to beat these guys. We're Texas, and we got hand signals, we got all kinds of stuff that they don't got. What do? They do all this stuff, and they got little guys running around in underoos and things like that. Ego is what made them make this move, and ultimately, I think ego is the thing that's going to punish them for making this move, because again, it wasn't cash. They haven't been able to dominate a weaker conference, just like you guys have all laid out. And ultimately, I think it was the decision of the people who have the ego and the money, but don't actually have to lace them up and run into people, who've decided this is a move we want to make so that we can, have some bragging rights at our dinner parties and things like that. While the young men out there and young ladies who have to go battle in these things or run around with ice bags because they are not ready to compete at that level right now.
It's at least 7 to 8 coaches, Nigel, that are coaching in the SEC that wish that they weren't coaching in the SEC, other than the money that they're going to get when they get fired and get shown the door. It's about 8 guys in that league who wish that they can get a job in the Big 12 or the Pac-12 or the ACC, where it's a little bit calmer than having to deal with the toughness of the SEC. It's not only a big dog league in the field, it is war in recruiting. It's a bloodbath on the recruiting trail, trying to get players. You add an NIL and the money that's involved in the game now. Man, it's tough sledding ahead for the Longhorns. I don't understand the move.
Texas will never be a brand associated with hubris. Texas hasn't had a lot of it in its entire history, and you can debate that either way. I think the decision itself is more about the future than it is the present. Texas could obviously have a better path of winning in the Big 12 year to year if they stayed. Oklahoma, as they proved with, I think, like 5 straight Big 12 titles, clearly had a better path in the Big 12 if they stayed. But this is about money. Revenue for the conferences by the end of the decade is supposed to be about $100 million for the SEC and $100 million for the Big 10. If you're in the Big 12, Pac-12, or ACC, you're looking at less than $50 million. So if you have schools in other conferences making twice what you do a year, you're going to fall behind. We're not far away, I think, from an era where players will have salaries. We're not far away from an era where coaches could be making $15, $20 million a year, and your on-field staffs are going to be huge, because I think the NCAA is looking at changes in that as well. And you have to have money to deal with all those resources and have them pulled in. And I think Texas is worried about, even with as much money as in Austin right now, about the future and keeping up with everyone else in college football if you're in a conference that's making half of what another conference is.
Yeah, we know both of these schools have the brand. We know both of them have the recruiting. I mean, they're both wrapping up top 10 recruiting classes. They've got a lot of influx of talent coming in. But Chris, I mean, from your perspective, looking at Oklahoma specifically, they're in a time of transition, right? Year one under Brent Venables, they put up historically bad numbers, specifically on the defensive side of the ball, which is his area. What do you think about their readiness as they set their sights on the SEC and just not this season, but one more?
They're a little behind, but if you look at their recruiting efforts, like Brent Venables, I believe they had the number 4 class in the country in 2023. They loaded up along the defensive line. I think they signed their first 5-star defensive lineman in over a decade. Brent Venables is making the adjustments he needs to get ready for the SEC. I think Oklahoma particularly could have benefited from another year in the Big 12 to build the roster up. Steve Sarkisian's a year ahead in terms of that adjustment process because he's been there a year longer. But Oklahoma just has to get better on the defensive side of the ball. And Brent Venables, frankly, has to find the balance on the defensive side of the ball. He's playing across from the veer and shoot that Jeff Lebby runs. It's a high-paced, fast-tempo offense that we see Tennessee run with such effectiveness. But you don't often see great defensive play across from it because of the tempo that they play with and what it puts on a defense, given the amount of snaps you're going to end up being on the field play to play. So I think Oklahoma needs to find the balance there while also continuing to build up depth along the front 7. That way it can rotate out and keep its best players healthy and energized during the game. Oklahoma had a hard time keeping everybody healthy last year. Wasn't a lot of depth. They're going to have more depth this year after the recruiting gains and some of the transfer portal. But Brent Venables just needs a little bit of time to build that roster up the way he needs to.
Chris, now, Brent Venables was the defensive coordinator at Clemson, and they had some really high-powered offenses that played with some tempo during that time. I think Oklahoma is probably in a better situation than Texas because Venables is known for being a legendary recruiter. There are guys on the recruiting trail who have stories after stories about how legendary Brent Venables is. If you ask people why he was so successful on the defensive side at Clemson, they don't talk a lot about schematics or him being an X's old guru. They talk about his ability to consistently sign first and second round draft picks on the defensive side of the ball and getting those kids to play extremely hard. He's a legendary recruiter, and his ability to restock the talent at Oklahoma, that's going to be the biggest thing that they have to overcome in order to be successful in the SEC, because recruiting in that league is a completely different level.
All right, so Carl says Oklahoma is more ready than Texas. That makes me kind of want to ask the question to everybody else. So real quick, Nigel, what do you think? Who's more ready right now, OU or Texas?
Can I vote for neither? I don't think either one of them is ready for this. And to be honest with you, I think neither one of them is ready for several conferences. I think Oklahoma and Texas would find themselves behind the 8 ball in the Big Ten. And based on the way the Pac-12 is looking next season, I think they'd struggle even in that conference as well. So, and Carl, I want to go back to something that Carl brought up. Having been a guy who was a defensive coordinator and a defensive coach for most of my career, and then stepped up to become a head coach. The problem is you're no longer able to do that day-to-day recruiting. You're not able to close those deals the same way that you were because you are now a CEO. And by the way, you have a whole nother side of the ball to worry about. So I think some of those old stories of Brent Venables from when he was at Clemson, when that could really be his cash cow, that could be his baby, just worried about signing the next Christian Wilkins, signing the next guy in the secondary. Your play is just so different and your role is so much different that I think it's going to be interesting unless he can find another Brent Venables who can do what he did at Clemson for him at Oklahoma. It's a different animal. And I've been there and I've done it. And when you're dealing with two different sides, I think it's going to be a struggle. If I had to pick one, I would actually probably lean towards Texas only because of the fact that, I just think Oklahoma is so far behind right now. And, I think that, Texas just at least offensively could compete.
Chris, one word.
I believe the score of the Red River rivalry last year was 49-0
Okay.
Texas. So I think that tells you all you need to know about who's more ready to go.
All right, there we go. I'm going to cast a vote for Texas as well. Got to hold everybody accountable here.